I will talk about approaches to returning foreign fighters in the EU and the Western Balkans. I added the Western Balkans also because there are a few issues where the approaches there have been more progressive than here, so there are things to learn. My talk is going to be more along the lines of political science and more practical issues. I must say my bachelor was actually in law, but then I specialized in political science. During my activities with the Institute, we also carried out some interviews with foreign fighters. There's a study on this. But this will not be the focus of this talk. If there's any questions about this kinds of information, the background, the motivation of foreign terrorist fighters from Austria, you can ask me in the Q&A session. I also wanted to announce that we will soon start a project, the EU project, very large one, on the rehabilitation and reintegration of terrorist and extremist offenders, including foreign terrorist fighters and their families. And hopefully I'll be able to report on that perhaps next year. To begin, what are we talking about really? We don't actually have very precise numbers, but these are some approximations. So far, we know about 1,600 adults that came back to the EU from Syria and Iraq, and between 150 and 200 children. This is also important to note that basically the large majority of returnees are actually adults, whereas the large majority of individuals still in camps in Syria are actually children. But I will come back to this issue a bit later. Talking about returnees, what do we actually mean? So there were several waves of individuals returning. So broadly speaking, practitioners and literature divides the travels and the returns in two main waves. So before 2014 and after, the ones that came before 2014 are usually regarded as less dangerous or less indoctrinated. The ones that left afterwards are considered to be more fanatic. In any case, the point here is to say that these early returns, so before we even had this big debate about camps, these early returns in the majority basically just happened without particular notice, neither legal nor political, except in some cases where there was evidence found about their activities there and which prosecution can actually occur. In Austria, there's quite a high number of individuals prosecuted for terrorism. If we look at, for example, the number of prisoners at the moment, it is also quite high in relation to other countries and per capita, as it were. So there's these individuals who basically return on their own, in the majority men, of course. Then there's also the extradition from Turkey. So individuals who are there in prison and then they were basically delivered back to Europe. There's a couple of cases in Germany, for example. And then there's a very highly debated issue of repatriation. So here we're talking about individuals in camps in northern Syria. And here states would actually have to actively repatriate them home. And what are we talking about in this case? Again, we don't have very concrete numbers, but some approximate numbers. These are numbers that were collected by a non-governmental organization and published in a report last year. It's called Europe's Guantanamo, and it's a very, I think, telling name to illustrate the kinds of conditions that people are dealing with there. So according to this report, there are, as you can see, between 385 and 460 foreign terrorist fighters in northern Syria from the EU, and 20, so these are numbers from the EU only, and 25 in Iraq. And as you can see, the number of children is basically a lot higher. I included here also numbers for particular countries. Of course, the NGO especially focused on the countries that have larger numbers of individuals. So Belgium, for example, 40 children, 21 women. As I say, the majority are children, and then the rest is more or less women. So there are some men there, but it's not a very significant number. You can see here that France has the highest number of of individuals, 250 children and 80 women. Germany, also comparatively high, 150 children and 50 women. And the Netherlands, also 75 children and 25 women. I asked also in Austria, the Austrian Foreign Ministry, if there are some Austrian individuals there, and the answer was there are about a dozen. So about a dozen individuals there of Austrian nationality, and the majority are children. So we're basically only talking about people with nationality. One can imagine that there are going to be also individuals there that are from the EU but don't have the nationality. So for them, the repatriation is even more unlikely. Recently, so actually this month in October, this year, actually a few days ago, Germany and Denmark repatriated, as you can see here, a number of women and children. Of course, as other commentators also say, this is not a significant number if you look at the total number, but still, compared to other countries such as France, where repatriations are basically almost non-existent. So Germany repatriated 8 women, 23 children, and Denmark 3 women and 14 children. And I also included here the tweet. I mean, it's not the whole tweet, it's part of the tweet of their foreign ministry, to see how they frame this. And basically the argument is to say, you know, it's not the children's fault that they were there, so we cannot punish them, you know, because their parents decided to go there. It was not their choice. On the other hand, it's also said that the women will be prosecuted. And this is, I mean, thinking about the whole approach to returnees, it was initially thought that women are not necessarily, are more along the lines of victim than perpetrators. So there was a certain amount of lenience towards women, or at least not such a big focus on them. And it must also be said that depending on the cultural background, in some cases, the argument can be made that women were more or less forced to go. But this has changed recently. So now European countries are systematically prosecuting women returnees to the extent that they can find the evidence for their deeds there. And this is a difference to the Western Balkans, for example, where women are under observance, so they are surveilled in a certain sense, but they are not prosecuted. That's a different, and they work generally more with communities and integration there and so forth. Just to give some other examples, so last year also, so you can see it's like really small drops in the sea. Last year, Germany also repatriated a number of women and children, Finland as well, and also Belgium. Basically, in Belgium, the approach is to say, we want to take children back, but not necessarily women, and also children, usually only younger ones, so under 12, because they're considered less dangerous. This is also from the same report to give you an idea overall about the composition of the population there. So you can see 94% are women and children. This is overall, including all the other nationalities. And what is more, almost half the children are under the age of 5. Whereas the majority are younger than 12. There's also quite a large number of children who are actually without parents, so in an even more dire situation. This is just to give you an opposite example. In a different research project, I was dealing a little bit more with the Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and I found that actually in the Republic of Moldova, there were 2 repatriations. Of course, they do not have this high number of foreign fighters, but nevertheless, they repatriated 2 women and their children, and this was actually framed in the media as something good. So the president was basically gaining political capital by doing these kinds of activities. It was, in fact, with the cooperation of Turkey that they managed to return the women and the children. Also, some other examples from the Western Balkans. There were several waves of repatriation. For example, Kosovo repatriated in one go 110 individuals, and also Bosnia. And this, of course, I actually forgot to mention before that these repatriations usually occur with the logistical help of the United States. So this is also what the foreign minister of Germany said officially, but also in this case, it is known that the Americans actually helped and even, I guess, yeah, suggested to have these kinds of repatriations. The American position has been for a very long time now to say European countries need to take their citizens back. And there's many arguments why they should be done, even if it's not for humanitarian reasons, even if one only thinks about security considerations. It is, of course, better to take people back, even if there's an assumption that they're radicalized in a way or another. It's better to take them back and de-radicalize them, reintegrate them, rather than wait, because the more you wait, the more likely it is for kids who become adolescents and adults to become very, very angry with their countries of origin, who just refused to take them back. Now I'm going to mention a couple of legislative aspects. So yes, it was the crimes against humanity was mentioned before, and I will also mention it in my talk. As I mentioned, I don't work as a lawyer. However, it's important to mention these items here as well. So the legislative framework is very much drawing on this directive. On terrorism, and the point of this directive was to add a couple of additional actions or types of behavior to be criminalized. So of course, before there was still terrorism and all sorts of terrorist acts, which basically consists more or less from criminal act plus ideological motivation. And of course also belonging to a terrorist organization. But what happened then was to basically expand the criminalization of terrorism beyond terrorist acts themselves. So thinking about, for example, radicalization as a process that can at some point lead to political violence or to terrorism. What this new legislation does is to basically criminalize parts of the phases before that end point, which is terrorism. So, for example, traveling for terrorist purposes is also a crime. Receiving training is a crime. Recruitment, organizing or otherwise facilitating traveling for the purpose of terrorism is criminalized, and a number of other issues. And it is, of course, a question of debate to which extent this makes sense and how one should deal with these kinds of behaviors. Because there can be, of course, some kind of disconnect also between what the person does and the cognitive aspect. So, for example, you will have individuals who were in Syria and who will receive a higher sentence because of that, but who might actually be de-radicalized in their heads, whereas you can have individuals who didn't manage to travel, who tried to travel, were prosecuted and convicted with a relatively low sentence then, but who are actually in their mind still highly radicalized. And one example of these individuals was actually the attacker from last year, who was prevented from traveling, was prosecuted, convicted, he came out, but his radicalization basically never stopped. Indeed, it became more intensive. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the issue of women more in particular, because it is just a fact that when we talk about returnees, we mainly mean nowadays women and children, actually. So the Islamic State has done a very good job, if I may say myself like that, to motivate women to join, which might sound counterintuitive because, of course, we know that the roles of women in the Islamic State were not particularly prominent. Indeed, we're dealing with a highly patriarchal society and so forth. However, in their propaganda, they managed to create a picture where women had a very important role to play. And if you think about the project of the IS as an Islamic state, having the contribution of women was absolutely essential. And this is important to consider thinking about the degree of guilt, as it were, in the case of women. So even if women, for example, did not necessarily fight or engage in violence, their being there, their supporting activities were absolutely essential for this project to function. And another thing that I wanted to point out is that, of course, women tend to be in this particular scene tend to be more active online than offline because of various practical reasons. But in this online area, it was noticed times and times again that women can be even more extreme than men. So here is a citation, how one woman reacted to the video of a decapitation. In terms of motivations, just really simplistically said, looking at cases of female female sympathizers or members perhaps of the AS, one can say that generally motivations are the same as those of men. So initially it was this idea of saying that women go for romantic reasons, they are lured, they fall in love and so forth. And again, I'm excluding the cultural aspect here. And then especially looking at their online activity, but also seeing how women become very active in various kinds of roles, such as recruiting other women and policing other women and so forth. It was noted that, well, actually, first of all, there is also very clear political motivation for them as well. And generally, you can see the same kinds of things, such as, status, recognition, trying to right a number of wrongs that they perceive. So, also helping the people out there, fighting a dictatorship, creating this ideal project of an Islamic state and so forth. At the same time, it is of course important to look at these things also from a gender perspective, and understand certain specificities that are associated with women. And here it's also important to remember that the Islamic State itself in its propaganda promoted a very gender biased, as it were, picture of men and women. So men are usually these warriors, the heroes, the ones who defend their community and their family, and the reign of the woman is at home. So the main task of the woman in this society is supposed to be to take care of the family and to educate children. And this is yet another issue that comes up very often, especially in the political debates. So the role of women in perhaps indoctrinating the next generation of terrorists. This is just an overview of motivation and other kinds of theoretical background to understand more why individuals radicalize and how organizations work. Here again, just to mention the idea of fighting. So it is not entirely clear whether or not women have actually engaged in actual fighting. Of course, terrorism of this jihadi type is it's a man's world, but the organization has also produced and disseminated these kinds of pictures. Women are known to have trained to use weapons. And the IS has actually produced an innovation in the jihadi scene, which is to say, well, if it's necessary, if we don't have enough men, then women can also engage in battle. And this is something that before, like for example, Al-Qaeda was inconceivable. And now we're the topic of crimes against humanity. This has a little bit to do with the fact that when people return, I think it was mentioned, was talked a little bit yesterday as well, the issue of evidence. Yeah, so it is sometimes difficult to establish facts in relation to terrorism, for which reason we have now more and more cases where the prosecution resorts to crimes against humanity. So this is, for example, the case of Jennifer W. In Germany, who is accused of basically letting a young girl die in the sun. She and her husband had a slave and her daughter, and as a punishment for the daughter, she was left outside at 45 degrees, and she basically died. So the crimes against humanity that were invoked in this case were enslavement, disenfranchisement, exploitation, and deprivation of liberty. And the prosecution requested the life sentence. Now to go a little bit more into the practical part, how to manage returnees. This kinds of information or lessons learned or best practices very much draw on the work on the Radicalization Awareness Network. That is, I don't need to, I think, explain what it is, but in any case, one of the topics they're dealing with is returnees, and I had the opportunity to work on a number of papers, but also updating a manual on returnees, and also more specifically on working with children. And here you can see, more or less a little bit more systematically what I've seen, what I've said before. Going to be more quick because I think I only have 5 minutes left. Generally, the phases of dealing with returnees are first of all risk assessment, where also intelligence services are involved. In France, for example, there's this so-called investigating judge. Then there's prosecution, incarceration, rehabilitation, so more or less the kinds of things that happen in prison, and then reintegration back to society, which is a probation thing, but where of course also the civil society has a very important role to play. There are also specific approaches to dealing with returnees. So, for example, Germany has this construct called returnee coordinator, and there's an overall coordinator at the Länder level. Not all the Länder, but the ones that have basically have this issue with individuals coming back from Syria. And the point of this coordinator is basically to coordinate all the various kinds of actors that are involved in this process. So it's a so-called multi-agency approach involving not just child protection services, but also prison, probation, schools, from the work, from the individual, so from employment actors and so forth. So it's a very complex kind of machinery, and somebody has to have an eye on what is going on and who is responsible for what. And a very important point is also here the cooperation between social services and security services, which is of course oftentimes difficult because of a number of reasons. And the idea is how to make this communication work well. There's also other kinds of approaches. This is from the Western Balkans with a national coordination or a national action plan, such as the one from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm not going to go into details, but there is a paper on this also, and I can share it if you want. This is the manual that I was mentioning, and together with Thomas Renard, we are updating this manual at the moment. So here is a very brief overview of what we're dealing with. So first of all, the various kinds of motivations of individuals who come back, some key points, and here, for example, this multi-agency approach. So this multi-agency approach really has to happen from day one. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a little bit of a misconception to think that we start thinking in this multi-agency terms when the person comes out of prison. This is wrong. This has to happen from day one, from the moment where the person is actually coming back. Actually, talking to returnee coordinators in Germany, they say, well, we have to start whilst the person is still there. Yeah, we also already have to have a plan in place when the person is still there. Another important point is, of course, a tailored approach for returnees. So it has to be tailored to the individual case because each individual has a different background, different needs, and thinking about this concept of risk and needs and responsibility, these variables are going to be different depending on the individual person. The manual also differentiates between prosecution and no prosecution, because of course there will be cases where prosecution will not be possible, and in those cases there are also things that can be done, in particular working with, for example, exit organizations, and this multi-agency approach basically remains the same even if police and prison, for example, are not involved. And then there's also a part on children which require a special approach. There is a number of challenges with the prosecution. I think I can say something about this because maybe there's more interest for this aspect. So there's, of course, different profiles I mentioned depending on the radicalization degree. There is difficulty sometimes in gathering evidence, as we know. There's different regimes. For example, here in Austria and actually in the majority of countries, you have the normalization regime where it is expected that people, by having contact with others, will in fact have more chances to be de-radicalized and successfully reintegrated. Other countries such as France, Belgium, or the Netherlands, they concentrate them in special wings. And this has short-term an advantage because you can contain the threat. However, afterward it is incredibly difficult to have them reintegrated in society. There's, of course, a negative public opinion on returnees, and there doesn't seem to be a willingness to actually explain to people why it makes sense to have them back, even for security reasons. Yeah, this is a couple of guiding principles, which I will not go very much in detail, but I think what is important to know or to remember is that offenders are capable of positive change. I mean, if this kind of thinking is valid in other cases, then it should be also valid probably for terrorists and extremists. And there are actually historical examples, such as, for example, the Brigate Rosse in Italy at some point in the past, where really a huge cohort of individuals were rehabilitated. So it is possible to rehabilitate, to reintegrate individuals, even if they are terrorists. Here for the safety and security methods, I think I would only mention a risk assessment. And I know my time is almost up, so just for the moderator, I'm going to be done in maximum 2 minutes. Here, I think risk assessment is an important thing, and it has been mentioned here as well in other countries. It's important. This risk assessment needs to establish where the person is at any given point, but the risk assessment also gives them information about what can be done about the person in terms of reintegration, rehabilitation. The point of the risk assessment is it has to be done on a regular basis, so not just only once, and it has to be done from the very beginning, so not only when the person is released back to society. On the other hand, there shouldn't be such a high expectation from risk assessment, because it is not a solution to everything. So it's something that helps professionals think about the case better, helps professionals to structure their thinking, but that does not give the solution. And that's why it's extremely important to have trained specialized staff on these issues, both in prison and in probation, in particular social workers and psychologists. I mean, rehabilitation, again, there's a number of principles that need to be considered. But for me, the most important one is occupation. So it is extremely important for the individual coming out of prison to have a meaningful occupation that basically is not just something to do, but actually fulfills the person, gives the person a purpose. And the second important thing is the social environment. So for example, if the individual goes back to the previous social environment, as it was the case with our attacker, then there's absolutely no way in which this individual has actually a chance to be radicalized and move away from the radical thinking and people. Just lastly now, a couple of words on children. There's another recent report according to which children in these camps that I mentioned basically die on a continuous basis, 2 every week. So it is really a very serious situation there. All the EU countries have, of course, signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which actually obliges them to take action in this case. And I've actually checked to see if there's any policy or handbook that, you know, explicitly said, well, countries are obliged to take the children back, and they all stop short of actually saying that. So, and the convention, I think, doesn't help very much, because it doesn't take into consideration this scenario where the child is not in the country, but is outside the country. There's, of course, children of different kinds. As I mentioned before, the majority of them are actually very young. I'm just going to skip this, but these principles, I think, are important for dealing with children. So the existence of trauma can be assumed really in all cases. And there has been a French study looking at child returnees, and they found evidence of trauma in each single case. So even if we're dealing with older children who might have perhaps taken up a weapon or something like this, it has to be assumed that also in those cases they had this experience of trauma. The main thing with children is different than the one of adults, of course. And the main approach here is reintegration, normalization. So the best thing, or the best way, according to psychologists also, to deal with children returning is to create a normal atmosphere, a normal space for them. It's important for them to go to school as soon as possible and to just start having a normal life, because children are quicker to, to recuperate from those kinds of experiences than adults. And of course, the indoctrination, especially at a young age, I mean, can basically be discarded. Dealing with children, of course, depends on the overall architecture, which is not as developed in every country. So this multi-agency approach is actually still lacking, for example, here, and professionals are working on this to make it better. Finally, and this is my last slide, again, trauma is essential and central in the case of children. Normalization is very important, especially schools here. There is a debate about the role of families and family reunification. So, for example, in Austria, the idea is, to give children back to their at least immediate families if the parents are in prison. Other countries such as France, take this as an indicator. Basically, they think of it as child protection services in the normal sense, and tend to see families more like a threat. Yeah, and indeed, I mean, objectively speaking, families can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on whether or not they actually themselves are radicalized or not. Imprisonment, to my knowledge, we don't actually have cases of this so far, but in any case, the UN recommends for children, so we're talking about up to 17, imprisonment should be avoided at all costs. It should be really a means of last resort. And thank you very much, and sorry for going a little bit over the time.